So I'm going to start now with the last session or the last keynote session for the conference. And before I introduce the speakers or introduce the people who will be running this session, I just want to spend 2 minutes telling a bit of kind of small things at the end of the conference. The first one is I'd like to thank on behalf of the entire team and the conveners, Xenia Northmore and Stein van Kessel, to everyone who have participated throughout the conference. Online conferences can be daunting and difficult, and I think that apart from all the technical bits that we can provide, a lot of the success of this conference has been the quality of the papers, but also the kind of mood and relationship we have built in this nice community. And I think that it's what's behind it. And I'm quite pleased that the conference has gone so well, or at least that's how I feel. Let me know if you had any comments on the other hand, or things that might have been improved in the future. But so far, I'm quite pleased. And on behalf of the team, I'd like to thank to the speakers, to people donating their time, to the chairs, to Cristóbal Rodríguez Calvázar. Yesterday, he spent a couple hours with us talking about his book. So thank you very much for that. I also like to give a special thanks to a team that's been behind the scenes for the entire conference. Julie Becker, you've seen her probably in the green room, those who are speakers or chairs. She's our technical coordinator, has done a splendid job preparing the entire conference, and I'm quite grateful for that. Tamida Khanam and Manisha Patel, they work at the School of Politics and International Relations, and they have gone above and beyond to what it's required to work on this conference, and I'm also incredibly grateful to them. And to our amazing student ambassadors, thank you very much for the time, for the work, for the effort, for joining in the last minute. So that's it. It's kind of quick chat just to say thanks to everyone. And now I'm going to leave the stage to the people who are going to be presenting the latest version of this long-standing series of books about the British elections. It feels weird not to have an election every 2 years, but I guess that we're going back to some sort of normality now. So I don't know, Rob, please, do you want to jump in? Thank you very much. I think Will, Steve.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to see if I can bring my slides up here. So there's going to be 4 of us speaking. It's kind of like, because this is a collective operation, this book, and so this is a collective launch. So I'll speak first. Then Chris Butler will be talking about candidates and MPs in the election. Then Will Jennings will be talking a little bit about the polls in the election and the results, and then Steve Fisher will be presenting at the end on some of the geography of the election results. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen now. Okay. Hopefully, can you all see? I mean, please shout if you can't see. So, as Javier mentioned, this is the latest in the series, going back all the way to 1945. Quite daunting to take over a series that has been running for so long and is associated with illustrious names like David Butler, Dennis Kavanagh, and Phil Cowley. Even more daunting to do it in the midst of a global pandemic, and that is what myself, Tim, Will, and Paula have bravely or foolishly sought to do. But this book isn't only our effort. We had a number of outstanding contributors, including our predecessor, Phil Cowley, who contributed the first chapter, and then Melon Allen Wager on Brexit, the Dominic Ring team on the press, who contributed to a number of chapters, Chris, along with Rosie and Jennifer Hudson, who have written, Rosie Campbell and Jennifer Hudson, have written about political candidacy and recruitment. We've introduced a new chapter on politics in the devolved nations. We felt that was sorely overdue. Ailsa Henderson, Roger Awan Scully, and Jonathan Tong contributed on that. And then we also promoted we split the traditional results analysis appendix into 2, with half of it now in the main text, that's Curtis Fisher in English, and then further analysis dealing with what I would describe as the geekier specifics in the traditional spot in the appendix. I am going to speak to some of the material in the top half here, in particular, some of the decisions made by the parties and what we've learned from talking to people in all of the parties. So unusually for me, for those who know me from past EPOPs, quite a qualitative presentation rather than a quantitative presentation. If you go back to the very first of these books, led by R.B. McCullum and written co-authored with Alison Redman, you will find the following observation, which is that the Duke of Wellington once observed that you could no more describe a battle than you could describe a ballroom. Still less, it might be said, can you describe a general election. One thing is certain about such an event as a general election: it is not simple. That is, of course, true of every election. It's very true of the election that we studied, and I'm putting it up here as a kind of get-out clause for anything that you feel I have misinterpreted, misunderstood, or got wrong. It's not my fault. Elections are just difficult. So I'm going to cover some of the questions that I think have been much debated since the election, and what we've learned about those questions from talking to the people involved in all of the parties. The first question is, why did the election come about when it did? Why did we end up with a December election in 2019? It did not seem obvious that autumn that an election would arrive before the end of the year. The autumn kicked off with a pretty epic power struggle between a government that was determined to complete the Brexit process as swiftly as possible and the House of Commons that was determined to prevent it. One of the Johnson team told us that they had anticipated that from the summer, that they would have to play the hardest game because they don't have a majority, and these people, i.e. their fellow MPs in the Commons, are not going to come with you. In short, they expected it to be a battle, and a battle in which they would be defeated on several points, as indeed they were. Soon after Parliament returned, the Commons seized power to control parliamentary business through the Letwin Amendment, and then forced the government, and then seized the power to force the government to seek a Brexit extension through the so-called Ben Bill, which then eviscerated what was left of Johnson's majority as he withdrew the whip from 22 MPs. MPs also twice rejected calls from Johnson's government for an early election. Despite this, by the time we got to mid-October, a majority of MPs had backed his Brexit deal, 329 to 299, and Labour had indicated they were open to negotiations over the timetable for a debate. So at that point, it didn't seem that an election was either necessary to get Brexit done or even necessarily likely, given that the Commons had rejected attempts to an election just weeks earlier. So how did this happen? Well, first of all, it's important to remember that defeats in the Commons were priced into the Conservative strategy. There was an electoral element to the pugilism that we saw that autumn. Strategists in the Conservative Party told us that they felt that the voters did not see an election as necessary. It's the Brenda from Bristol problem, in short. And they felt they had to show the electorate that an election was the only way out of the Brexit impasse. The government also didn't believe that negotiations over a timetable for the withdrawal agreement would have proceeded in good faith. They dismissed that offer as a delaying tactic that would have been used to undermine the withdrawal agreement, and that it would not have been in a state that the government could have supported by the end of that negotiating process. The EU extension of the Article 50 deadline also meant that Labour had lost its main justification / pretext for blocking an election that they had claimed for much of the previous 2 years to want as their preferred way to resolve the Brexit issue. The really critical point, though, came when the SNP and the Liberal Democrats put forward an initiative for a simple majority election bill. And that was critical because it changed the Commons arithmetic. Now, there's been a lot of argument in Labour about whether that change in the Commons arithmetic was actually decisive. In a sense, that argument is moot because it was perceived to be decisive by basically all sides of the Brexit divide within the shadow cabinet and within the Corbyn leadership. So they therefore then backed an election and told loyalist MPs to back an election. So whether or not there was a way of averting it didn't really matter. At that point, an election was bound to happen. However, I do want to emphasize that all of this is a story that's applied backwards to a process that was incredibly chaotic when it was occurring at the time. And indeed, one of our sources cautioned us not to seek too much for consistency in MPs' thinking. MPs were thinking at the time in the same way as the government was governing, whack-a-mole, all hour to hour, day to day. So although that's the story as it proceeded, it's as it seems to us now, it's more coherent than perhaps it seemed to those involved at the time. The second question that has been much debated since the election happened is why Labour were unable to agree a clear and coherent Brexit policy to take to the electorate. Basically, everyone in Labour agreed that the Brexit policy that Labour ended up with going into the 2019 election was not ideal. And we had a number of different sources with different views on Brexit from Labour offering us views along those lines. One pointed out that the defeats to the government that were much celebrated on the Remain side that autumn were a chimera, a mirage, because actually they weren't leading to anything else, and they weren't able to find a way to get them to lead to anywhere else. Then we had a Conservative source during the campaign who told us that he was absolutely flabbergasted that Corbyn said he would be neutral in a second referendum campaign. This guy's running to be Prime Minister and he can't even take a position on the biggest issue facing the country and facing and affecting the lives of every single one of the people. It was absolutely the worst of both worlds. And another Lotto source reflected to us that everybody who didn't want hard Brexit should reflect on what happened during those 2 years, May's side, our side, the hard Remain side, the Lib Dems and some of our own side, and just think we all effed up. Your number one, don't end up with this, is a hard Brexit, and that's what we got. It was an utter failure. So why did Labour fail so utterly to develop a coherent alternative that they could steer the electorate towards? Well, the root cause, structurally speaking, was Labour's Brexit dilemma. The voters and members that Labour had going into the 2017-19 Parliament were strongly pro-Remain, but the voters and constituencies that Labour needed to win tended to lean towards Leave. Now, that dilemma divided Labour from top to bottom all the way through the 2017 to 19 Parliament, and they never really found an effective way to resolve it. What made things worse was the emergence of the People's Vote campaign in 2018. Now, it's important to note two things about the People's Vote campaign. One, it was headed up by a series of people who were associated with the pre-Corbyn Labour era and were therefore held in deep suspicion by the Corbyn leadership. The second is that from the outset and openly, their focus was on trying to get the Labour Party to shift their support towards the second referendum. As one of the People's Vote leadership told us, there was only one big party whose stance was in question, and that was the Labour Party, and our goal was to change their front bench position. So that further exacerbated the divides that already existed within Labour. A further factor here was indeed Corbyn himself, in that he never offered a consistent steer on what position he wanted to take on an issue that didn't seem to interest him. As a result, Labour ended up trying to please both sides and ended up pleasing neither. As one of the leadership's advisors told us, Labour's Brexit strategy was like watching the director of a play rewrite the script on the fly to keep the cast happy while the audience headed for the exits. The price of this became clear as we went into the campaign. As Labour entered the campaign, the top leadership team was still arguing over what their Brexit policy should be and whether or not they should be trying to appeal to Leave voters or to Remain voters. And Jeremy Corbyn was still not offering any view on that. He prioritised holding together both of those sides of the argument within one party. So those who were sympathetic towards him said, well, in a sense, he did his best to bridge a divided party. The price of that was he never chose between the two options on offer, and the price of unity was incoherence. As another source within the Labour Party told us, They had twice daily campaign strategy group meetings, and it would just be the same argument all day, every day. Are we trying to appeal to these Remainers, or are we trying to appeal to these non-traditional Tory voting leavers? And it always ended in stalemate. So if Labour's messaging on this issue seemed incoherent in the campaign, that wasn't by accident, that was by design. They were incoherent from the top down. As one of the advisors put it to us once Corbyn had announced he would remain neutral on the campaign, you had this absurd situation where any deal negotiated by Labour would be presented to the British public as an unwanted orphan, with the people who negotiated campaigning against it and Jeremy himself saying nothing about it. The third question that's been much discussed is why the Liberal Democrats decided to pledge to revoke Article 50, a policy which led to one of the more memorable moments in the leaders' debate, the televised leaders' debate, when first a Leave voter and then a Remain voter poured scorn on the policy. The Leave voter saying that the policy amounted to telling 17.3 million people that you think they're stupid and don't know what they were voting for, while a self-described passionate Remainer said that the Lib Dems had lost her vote because they stand on a manifesto to unilaterally cancel Brexit. It is undemocratic. So why did the Liberal Democrats attach this albatross of a revocation policy around their necks? Well, the reason, again, much like with Labour, is that it was an effort to achieve party unity at the cost of electoral appeal. The new leadership, it's worth remembering, Swinson only came into office weeks before the election came along, felt that they could not defy a strong desire amongst the Liberal Democrat membership for a revoke policy. Some in the party had been wanting to adopt a revoke policy for 3 conferences. Since the previous conference, there'd been a petition with 6 million signatures, so it didn't feel like we could turn around to members and say, well, that's just ridiculous. And others pointed out that this wasn't something actively pushed by Swinson, but it was something that she had to embrace because otherwise she would get run over by the members and be forced to embrace it anyway. So she felt that she would get out ahead of it rather than being forced into it, something that would not look good in her first conference. However, at the time when they adopted the policy, Liberal Democrat strategists felt that it wasn't going to matter very much because it would only actually apply if the Liberal Democrats achieved a majority in the House of Commons, which was, of course, a very unlikely outcome. They, by their own admission, failed to anticipate how their political opponents were going to seize upon this policy and use it against them. So, another question. Why in 2017 was there no repeat of the drama that we saw in 2019 was there no repeat of the extraordinary drama we saw in the 2017 campaign? Incidentally, these cartoons are all ones that we've used in the book, so hopefully you find some of them interesting. As you can see here, in 2017 we see a strong convergence of the parties' support all the way through the campaign. In 2019 you get something different. Will may talk about it more, where the two parties' support rise in parallel. Well, the reasons are all to do with how the two largest parties reacted to the result of 2017. For the Conservatives, 2017 was a disaster that had to be avoided, the repetition of which had to be avoided at all costs. As one Conservative source put it to us in industrial language, the overwhelming pressure was to avoid effing it up again. They conducted a major review of the 2017 result led by Sir Eric Pickles, and that was followed by root and branch organisational reform of CCHQ led by Sir Mick Davis and Brandon Lewis. They also installed a campaign chief early with full authority over all aspects of the campaign. Contrary to his myth as a kind of Svengali of the Johnson administration, Cummings was, by all accounts, and all sources agreed on this, not a major part of the day-to-day campaign in 2019. They then launched a safety-first manifesto. As one source put it to us, the media seeks a narrative, and there were only 2 narratives with the manifesto. One was they effed it up again, and the other was, isn't this thin or boring? We prefer to have narrative 2 rather than narrative 1. The other thing they sought to do was, rather paradoxically, given they've been in power for over a decade, was to run as a change party and a change candidate. and basically utilising Johnson's evident differences to his predecessors in order to do that. We did a lot of work on public services to not necessarily win on them, but at least neutralise them, talking about schools, hospitals and police relentlessly since Boris became PM helped to negate these hesitations. I'm conscious that I'm taking up too much time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit for the last couple of these. So Labour's problem was the opposite. While the Conservatives tried to change everything from 2017, Labour tried not to change anything at all, even though the context was a great deal different in 2019 to in 2017. Corbyn, as I think it was Marcus Roberts from YouGov said, with Corbyn, the souffle doesn't rise twice. So you couldn't get the surge that you saw in 2017 again. Essentially, 2 years of relentless controversy had toxified Corbyn in the eyes of the electorate. And as one of the senior campaign team put it to us, the first time I was in the north with Jeremy during the campaign, I was really shocked when someone raised the issue of him being an IRA sympathiser outside of an event. And then that got picked up by regional media. For 2 years, that's what they've been told he was. And we hadn't tackled that at all. We'd misjudged the impact of those messages being laid down in solid layers over several years. But Corbyn himself was also different. He was more suspicious of the media, more ill-tempered, more uncooperative with aides, and more diffident in his set-piece campaign appearances. As one source said to us, Jeremy wouldn't cancel any time on the road to prepare for the televised debates. So we would have ridiculous situations where he would be at an event like a CLP meeting with 300 people the night before and not have time to rehearse or get prepped for a debate that would be seen by 7 million people. This also applied to the broader Labour campaign team. They were much more divided. They were much more at odds with each other. They leaked worse than ever. And as a result, they didn't want to talk to each other about stuff. As one source said to us, Lotto was chaotic in 2017. 2019 was clearly worse. There was a small cupboard with generals who didn't get on with each other. But it wasn't just about Labour in terms of running the same campaign and not being able to because they had changed. They were trying to run the same campaign against an opponent that had changed. And all sources within Labour had a lot of positive things to say, surprisingly enough, about how disciplined the Conservative campaign was and how difficult that made things for them. One said they were so disciplined they managed even to get Donald Trump to be disciplined, which is discipline on a special plane. Another said that they tried endlessly to build big dividing lines with the Tories on the NHS, but they couldn't because the Conservatives were also offering more money on the NHS. And when you put 10 billion next to 30 million for voters, that's not more or less. It's just two big numbers next to each other. Finally, it's worth remembering that there were other things going on beyond both parties' control. We had the implosion of the Lib Dems' Swinson-focused campaign. As one source from the Lib Dems put it to us, we started ahead of Labour amongst strong Remainers. Then in a 2-month period, Labour just destroyed us amongst that group. We lost strong Remainers in droves. If anyone had said in September, come election day, Joe Swinson is going to be less popular than Corbyn amongst Remain voters, they'd have responded, no effing chance. Yet that is what happened. There was also the decision of the Brexit Party to stand down candidates, which I won't talk too much about here because Steve's going to talk about that. But for the Liberal Democrats we talked to, that was the moment that, in one source's words, screwed them the most, because that was votes in the seats they were targeting that they could never get, but which would have made it easier for them to win seats. Then there was a huge list of things, such as flooding, NHS waiting lists, the London Bridge terror incident, the Trump visit, the boy on the A&E floor, the punch that wasn't, Boris hiding in the fridge, all of which failed to shift the campaign dynamic. And of course, structural factors such as the Conservatives' discipline and Labour's lack of it played a role in all of those, but perhaps also in some cases there was a role for luck as well. There is, of course, much, much more in the book, which is out on November 2nd. I've already taken up far too much time, so I'll now hand straight over to whoever is next, which is Chris, I think.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Slightly daunting following that excellent and fascinating presentation. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. I will crack on. So with Rosie Campbell and Jennifer Hudson, we looked at candidate selection and the makeup of the new parliament in terms of demographics, etc. And kind of two themes, really. So kind of the strife, because there was a snap election, yet again, emergency selection procedures were invoked by the main party, lots of anecdotes, examples of strife. But despite kind of the Russian nature of the selection process, we actually see kind of the same trends in terms of representation within the House of Commons. So improving representation of women and ethnic minorities, but this increased kind of convergence or homogenization of MPs in terms of their education or immediately prior occupational background. And one of the other things I want to touch on is this really sharp decline in MPs' parliamentary experience as well. That's really fast-forwarded, accelerated in 2019. So I'm going to touch briefly on selection procedures, briefly on electoral pacts from a party perspective, then on minority representation, education and occupational background, and the trends in parliamentary experience of MPs. So just starting with selection procedures. So the Conservative Party have a great clause in their constitution which allows the Conservative Party board to, quote, do anything necessary in order to select candidates in the case of a snap election. And in 2017, after they invoked this, there was considerable disgruntlement amongst various local parties about how the central party operated. To try and overcome this, the party resolved to select candidates in key seats by summer 2018, but they had failed to do so in many seats prior to the 2019 election, had to invoke emergency procedures again, but this time seemed to get through this with fewer complaints from local parties. For Labour, they were a bit further ahead. They'd selected 117 candidates in marginal seats prior to 2019, but still had a lot of gaps, in some instances because of MPs standing down late in the day, such as Tom Watson, MPs who had defected, so they needed new Labour candidates. Some of the candidates they'd selected early also didn't survive through the rigours of having been selected in a key seat, showed their inexperience, social media posts, etc., and had to be replaced. So again, emergency procedures were triggered. Candidates selected by representatives from local parties, regional boards, and the NEC. A lot of disgruntlement from the left of the party, feeling their candidates were discriminated against, but also it seems in several cases that rival unions were backing rival left-wing candidates, and this diluted the power of the left in candidate selections at times. There was also the drama over potential triggers of incumbent Labour MPs. Several MPs were triggered by their local parties. Some subsequently were reaffirmed as the Labour candidates, such as Margaret Hodge. But eventually in November, the NEC suspended the trigger process, and there was only one MP, Roger Godsiff, who was suspended by the NEC. Otherwise, all incumbent Labour MPs were automatically reselected. The Liberal Democrats were more kind of goody two-shoes. They'd got well ahead with their selections before the election, but perhaps slightly to their detriment, because of course they had this stream of defectors from other parties over the summer 2019, and not many winnable seats or potentially winnable seats left in which to place these new arrivals. So that led to some strife as local candidates were asked to make way for big names such as Chukwuemeka or Luciano Berger. I also want to touch briefly on parties' roles in electoral pacts. I'll leave the effects of the electoral pacts to the far more eminent sophologists on the panel. But I just wanted to touch briefly on Unite to Remain and also on Northern Ireland. So one of the things with the Unite to Remain pact between the Liberal Democrats, the Green Party and Plaid Cymru, which covered 60 constituencies in England and Wales, trying to make sense of where this pact was enacted. For example, the Green Party for the Liberal Democrats in Carshot and Wellington, which the Liberal Democrats lost to the Conservatives by fewer votes than the Greens polled. But the Green Party stood down for the Liberal Democrats in Penistone and Stockbridge, where the incumbent MP, Angela Smith, had defected to the Liberal Democrats, but she'd abandoned that constituency for the supposedly greener or yellower pastures of Altrincham and Sale West. So it's not kind of a clear pattern with these Unite to Remain seats. And one of the things that came out of our investigations was actually the veto power of Green local parties. So the complaints from some Liberal Democrats we spoke to that it was hard to develop a cohesive Unite to Remain targeting strategy because Green local parties were able essentially to veto whatever Green Party strategy essentially were agreeing with the Liberal Democrats over which constituencies the Unite to Remain pact should take place in. I also wanted to draw your attention to Northern Ireland, where considerable ground was broken with electoral pacts, and indeed, particularly due to the DUP's position on Brexit. So initially, the Ulster Unionists said that they would not support the DUP in any electoral pacts, but had to relented in the face of pressure from activists and from the community. But there was considerable ground broken. So the SDLP stood aside for Sinn Féin in a first, whereas they hadn't done previously because of Sinn Féin not taking up their seats in Westminster. The Northern Irish Green Party, which is a cross-community party, stood aside for Sinn Féin and the SDLP in some seats. And also in North Down, which is a seat vacated by the independent Sylvia Herman, the Alliance Party was supported by the SDLP and Sinn Féin standing down for them. Now, the Alliance refused to join any pacts, particularly valid kind of against the sectarian nature of pacts in Northern Ireland, but in North Down, they benefited from the two nationalist parties standing aside for their benefit. Coming on now to representation, the makeup of the new House of Commons. So there was a record 220 women elected to the House of Commons in 2019. Takes the percentage up slightly to 34% from 32%, still some way off of 50%, of course. Significantly, both the Labour and the Liberal Democrats now have over 50% female representation in their parliamentary party. Those are also the two parties who use all-women shortlists in their to select candidates. Liberal Democrats have only done this since 2016, after they returned no female MPs in 2015. But because both parties now have greater female than male representation, under the Equalities Act, they will not be allowed to use all-women shortlists going into the next election. Female representation amongst the Conservative Party improved slightly from 21% to 24%, and for the SNP, it remained around a third of their parliamentary party. There was a greater advance, a record number of ethnic minority MPs. 65 MPs self-identify as Black or minority ethnic. 37 of these 65 are women, so over half of them. It's still some way below the proportion of ethnic minority individuals in the British population, although it's getting close to the proportion of ethnic minorities amongst the adult British population. But whilst we see this kind of greater diversity in terms of gender and ethnicity, one of the patterns that comes through really strikingly is the kind of lack of diversity, if you like, in the educational and occupational background, both of MPs and of candidates. So in terms of how to read this table, so kind of read across, and the numbers will add up to 100 for MPs and for candidates. The Oxbridge column is the percentage of MPs or of candidates from each party who attended Oxbridge for either their undergrad or their postgrad degree. But you'll see the parties are now kind of strikingly similar in terms of the overwhelming majority of MPs having at least an undergraduate degree. This 10% for Labour with no degree is down from 24% as recently as 2015. So the party's educational backgrounds are becoming increasingly similar. In terms of the educational background of candidates, and bear in mind this is based on data from the British Representation Survey, and it's likely to be a slight bias in terms of who's returned it. I think those who went to university are more likely to return the survey. But we see here that over 80% of candidates having an undergraduate degree. This varies between party, but for example, even the Brexit party had the highest proportion of candidates without a degree. It's still only 21%. So a kind of political participation, standing for parliament, is very much associated with having been educated at university. And kind of a further perhaps kind of lack of diversity that, let me just get the right figure. There are over 300 MPs have graduated from just 14 universities. So it's not necessarily kind of a wide pool of higher education background as well that these MPs have experienced. I've also seen quite a fall in terms of MPs immediately prior occupations. This fall in MPs from a brokerage occupation such as law, education, or medicine, which used to be kind of the main recruiting pool for MPs, but this has massively declined. And what's taken its place, what we refer to as instrumental professions, i.e. people who worked in politics immediately prior to their election. And there's not a huge amount of variation across the parties in terms of prior professional background, but well over half now of MPs worked in something related to politics immediately prior to their election. And then where we see a particularly kind of interesting trend, this table shows the proportion of MPs by when they were first elected. So almost a quarter of MPs were actually first elected in December 2019. Over half were first elected since 2015. Indeed, over 3/4 were first elected since 2010. So fewer than a quarter of MPs have more than 10 years experience. So there are very few Labour MPs left with ministerial experience, and indeed fewer and fewer ministers from the Cameron-Clegg government still left in Parliament. So whereas perhaps previously people might be MPs for 30, 40 years, try to be MPs for life, we're seeing a decline in this. Some of this is no doubt due to the changing electoral geography. So, for example, Dennis Skinner would have been the Father of the House, but lost Bolsover as part of the Red Wall. But also a kind of increasing trend for people to leave the House of Commons after just a couple of terms. And we notice kind of some patterns when looking at retiring MPs who'd been elected Conservative or Labour MPs, particularly by gender. And obviously, in the febrile nature of the Brexit debate, there was a lot of abuse directed at politicians, particularly female politicians. And so this chart shows the average years spent in the House of Commons by MPs who are retiring, split down by party and by gender. And you'll see that Conservative women, those who've been elected as Conservative MPs who stood down, on average had only been in the House of Commons for 10 years, so quite a kind of short period of time before deciding to step down, whereas for other groups it was closer to 20. So there were some interesting variations within that data as to who was actually standing down at the 2019 election. Okay, so that's all I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much for listening, and I will hand over, I think, to Will.
Thanks, Chris. That's fascinating. Let me just share my slides. And let me know if that is showing. Hopefully it is. So I will skip quickly through and make sure I keep to my 15 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the polls and the votes during the campaign. And I would just like to start by reminding you of some senses just how mad this election cycle was. I think it's easy to forget that it feels a very long time ago. And I think it's probably true to say that anyone who suggests that they predicted with a high degree of confidence what would happen in the autumn of 2019 in terms of the election result, or even being an election, is either lying or made multiple predictions during the election cycle, because we had just this huge volatility of the electorate over a period of less than a year, with the slump in support for both the Conservatives and Labour, the appearance briefly of Change UK, who looked like they might redraw or at least, cause significant discomfort to the existing parties, but disappeared and kind of with a whimper. The rise of the Brexit party and latter decline, and also the rise of and then fading of the Liberal Democrats. And so I think it's really important for putting in context that we lived through this period of incredible volatility when the political actors were operating with a huge degree of uncertainty, often making very, very intractable choices. And I think that's one thing that I think is really key through the book. And I was going to say, kind of as a shout out, are there any pollsters in the house? I can see from one that we have one reformed academic, Patrick English, is in the audience. No others, I think. And actually, if you took May as your starting point and the European Parliament elections, pollsters obviously had a rocky year, and they had another tough time at the European Parliament elections. Obviously, second order elections like European Parliament elections are difficult for pollsters. Voters are less predictable. They're more likely to express protest votes, and it makes polling a much more difficult job. But in May, the pollsters had errors on average across the parties winning larger shares of the vote of well over 4% in some instances, or at least 3, which in previous general elections would have led to all sorts of calls for public flogging of pollsters and so forth. But partly because of the huge shock and volatility of the electoral system, of what was going on in the electorate was kind of ignored. But I think most pollsters would have entered the election with a great degree of trepidation. I think actually one of the characterizations of 2017 was the pollsters didn't have a great election, but they actually fixed their Conservative problem of the last 30 years by getting the Conservative vote pretty much bang on, but underestimating Labour. So I think in 2017 was certainly not as bad as 2015, but I think they were still looking to salvage a face. So what we had with the polls actually in 2019 was an exceptionally good performance, the pollsters' best performance for many years, an average error on the Conservative and Labour votes. Absolute error of less than 1.5 points, really. So in some regards, if you were someone who followed the polls through the campaign with a degree of confidence, what they were telling you, both in terms of the electoral result, but also the voting patterns, would have stood you in very good stead for when the election result rolled, as indeed it did. Well, when we get the exit poll in, and just to say, the exit poll also had, as ever, another good election, a slightly higher error than in 2019, but the exit poll, as those many people on here today were involved in that, told the story of the election, both in terms of the headline story, but also the voting patterns. And so I will say that in writing my piece for Sky News for the morning after, by the time we were getting the results from the exit poll, the estimates in, that already told us a huge part of the story about what was happening in the Red Wall, as it is known, and across the country. So that's just really kind of what I want to say about the polling context. Not a lot of it will be new to you, but I think it's an important bit of context. I want to talk just briefly about the parties polling, and I think in some ways the story of the parties polling activities are consistent with the broader organizational story that Rob told. The Conservatives had a highly structured and organized polling operation with polling, MRPs, focus groups, headed by Isaac Levido and Michael Brooks, with Hanbury's strategy working on data collection that fed into their in-house MRP model. And I think they obviously, as Rob was saying, had learned, the very hard lesson of 2017, and their MRPs were informing targeting of marginals alongside local knowledge, but they were very careful not to overextend, as they had done in 2017. In 2017, they'd used similar sorts of modelling approaches, but had left them their pieces in the wrong part of the board when the electorate shifted overall, meant they were targeting places they were never going to win as Corbyn mania took hold. And so Michael Brooks told us that they were going to make sure they won 350 seats, and anything over and above that is a bonus. And they, so in some sense, their polling operations were very conscious of the experience of the last 2 years in terms of parliamentary arithmetic, that having 360 or 370 seats made very little difference in terms of actually governing. And in terms of that modelling was informed by MRP modelling, but they ran a nightly tracker poll of 500 respondents to try and pick up changes in the mood of the electorate. I think one of the features of MRP modelling that isn't often discussed is the fact that often it takes quite a lot of time, A, to collect the data, but also even to run the modelling. That means that if we do get these moments of volatility with an electorate that is changing its mind at a fast pace, they're just too slow during election campaigns to pick up sudden rapid movements, then to feed into organisational decision making. Obviously, the Conservatives also used focus groups to test messaging, engage the emotional reaction of voters. And just to give you a sense of what we have in the book, I mean, one of the very interesting things that we found through our interviews, and Michael Brooks talking about the origins of Get Brexit Done, which came out of a focus group in Bury. And I won't read the whole quote, but they, the people were talking about the phrase, the Get Brexit Done in the group. And he said, I remembered I just passed a note to the moderator that said, just ask them what they think of this. And as soon as we said it, they were just like, yes, that's it, that's the one, because it captured the essence of what they were trying to say. And so in some regards, it's often easy in the era of 3-word slogans to think of these as very trite, but the slogan itself distilled their strategy, but also came through a very systematic process. Turning to Labour's polling operations, their activities were characterised by the same divisions as the rest of the campaign. In some ways, Labour's actually had a very sophisticated set of analysts. The sorts of work they were doing was sophisticated. They had their own MRP projections, which they were producing in-house from their own staff. And Southside HQ produced their own projections as well as detailed analysis of demographic trends. But that wasn't necessarily lining up or informing what the Leader's Office were doing. So target seats were produced by the Leader's Office that weren't informed by MRP modelling, but rather by naive swing calculations. And so the Leader's Office disregarded that MRP modelling in favour of polling from ICM commissioned by Carl Schoben, who was the deputy to Seamus Mill, to test campaign messaging and reaction. So even at the level of polling, the party was divided. And just to kind of pull out a quote, because it's always kind of interesting to see what you see online and think you'd be surprised to be manifested among professional politicians, was that Southside election analysts presented a report at Labour conference showing the importance of, in 2019, showing the importance of winning back Remainers, and the campaign co-chair Ian Lavery dismissed the polling data as from a Tory firm, so it couldn't be trusted. And so the sorts of reactions you see to YouGov polls online, on Twitter and so forth, was also not without some influence in terms of the party's operations. In some ways, for just turning lastly to the Lib Dems, it's an apocryphal lesson of the limits of MRP modelling, but also a party that didn't learn the lessons of the Conservatives in 2017. So the Lib Dems commissioned MRP analysis over the summer of 2019 when they were polling in the low 20s. And if you recall from the graph I showed, voting intents I showed you at the start, around that time, all the parties at one point or another were in the kind of low 20s. And so it looked like this kind of four-way fragmentation of British politics. And so because of that, those MRP estimates put it on 73 seats. So they already were kind of, their eyes were bulging at the possibility, and within a 5-point swing in 219 others. And so the party's election review described it as being like all their Christmases come at once. And so as that review highlighted, all their plans were developed at the height of optimism and detached from reality. And so just as the Conservatives had found in 2017, when the mood of the electorate shifted and they started to shed votes, that sort of targeting strategy that had been based on this idea that they could win not near to 300 seats turned out to be fantasy. And so I think that kind of that late shift, I think in MRP, kind of the electorate, well, those shifts in that can take place in the electorate ahead of the MRP modelling is quite important. So let me just say a few things about the British voter in 2019 and what we know. And obviously there has been a huge amount of analysis since. We are hugely grateful to the data generated by the British Election Study, both its internet panel and its face-to-face survey. Thankfully, its face-to-face survey dropped in time for us to complete our analysis. And I think, building on some of the points that Ed Fieldhouse and Jack Bailey were making one of the earlier panels today, I think the voting behaviour in 2019 reflected both the continuing disruptions of the referendum and a number of short-term factors, and the continuation of much longer-term changes in the party's electoral coalitions. And whereas the Leave vote coalesced behind the Conservatives, the Remain vote was much more fragmented across the political spectrum, both among the Remain parties, but actually Remain voters being more likely to vote for the Conservatives. And so I think it's crucial to understand the dilemma faced by Labour as being caught in a pincer movement, where Remainers made up a larger share of its vote, but they were losing a greater proportion of their Leave voters. So in absolute terms, the actual number of voters lost to each side were about even. And so I think anyone who presents the dilemma faced by Labour or the trade-off for something easy could be solved by some easy sort of triangulation is not really being particularly kind of straight with you. I think in some sense Labour did really face a huge structural problem that there was not an easy solution to. So they lost over 40% of their Leavers who'd voted in 2017 to the Conservatives, but 15% of the 2017 Labour Remainers switching to another Remain parties, but even it netted out at about the same number of voters. And so you can see that here. I mean, these are figures that you will obviously be well aware with, of the Leave vote heavily going to the Conservatives, whereas the Remain vote being much more fragmented across the political spectrum. So just to talk a little bit more about short-term, long-term factors, I think we could maybe distill down those short and long-term factors into a kind of core set of variables or kind of issues or what have you. In the short term, I think really the main factors that we've identified relate both to the respective leaders of the two main parties. In terms of issue, just the focusing issue of Brexit, and also to a little extent, it doesn't play up so much in some of the individual level survey data, but the party platforms. I think one of the features of the campaign was actually that voters recall more of Labour's pledges because there were so many, and many of those policies were popular when polled in isolation, but 53% of people thought the spending and promises were unaffordable, and 67% thought the promises would involve tax rises, and there were much lower numbers for people thinking that for the Conservatives. And so there was a sense among the electorate that although there were lots of, there was a kind of nice little shopping list that Labour had offered them, they weren't really convinced. And I think that did play a factor in how Labour's campaign didn't really hit the mark. And then alongside those, and I'll talk a little bit more about the evidence for those, in terms of alongside that, we have much longer term shifts in voting behaviour that we've seen in Britain over many decades. I don't in some ways like to talk about them as kind of even necessarily separate, because I think they're all heavily interrelated. Changes around age, education, where you might kind of say education has been a realignment as age, whereas class we're talking more about the alignment still, although we shift in a little bit of direction towards a possible long-term realignment, but also in terms of the value dimensions of British electoral politics. So just to say a few things about evidence that we present in terms of who switched their vote. So using data from the BES Internet panel, we looked at the strongest predictors of vote switching parties between 2017 and 2019, firstly for Labour and the Conservatives, and second for Labour to the Liberal Democrats. I mean, in those models, it is just striking how liking Boris Johnson by a long way was the strongest predictor of someone who'd voted Labour in 2017 going Conservative in 2019, followed by Leave. And obviously, in some ways, liking Boris Johnson and supporting Leave are very likely highly endogenous. But it was interesting that it was kind of Boris Johnson was a kind of pull factor to those Labour voters. We also find that being authoritarian on the liberal authoritarian dimension was a strong predictor of switching vote, which fits very much with the characterization of the social conservatives and the red wall Brexit voters shifting towards the Conservatives. On the other side, from people who voted, who went from Labour to the Lib Dems, it was interesting that disliking Jeremy Corbyn was the strongest factor, the push factor of Jeremy Corbyn pushing people from Labour to the Lib Dems, followed by liking Joe Swinson, and followed by favouring Remain. An interesting feature of what we found here was that being right wing on the left-right economic dimension pushed people from Labour towards the Liberal Democrats, which is consistent with the idea that maybe some of those Remainers were somewhat scared off by the policy offer that was offered by Labour and Corbyn in the election. Just to say a few things about leaders, I think one of the most interesting features of the campaign was not just the stability, but actually was that, essentially, as Robert said, Jeremy Corbyn was a much diminished figure in 2019 compared to 2017. These are the likability ratings. This graph shows the likability ratings of Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and in 2019, and Theresa May in 2017 and Boris Johnson in 2019. And you can see there that Jeremy Corbyn's ratings in 2019 were just more than a point lower, or roughly a point lower on the 10-point likability scale. And so he was considerably less popular and less liked through the campaign, even though the trend maybe suggests he kind of gained a little bit and Boris Johnson fell a little bit, but actually there was this huge gap between the leaders. Whereas in 2017, you can see that this huge shift in the popularity of Jeremy Corbyn, catching up with Theresa May as she kind of fell away during a bad campaign, meant that the two leaders ended up very, very close. And so one of the deep ironies, I think, of the election, when we talk about the star power of Boris Johnson, his particular appeal to the electorate, that actually by the end of the 2019 campaign, he was less well liked than Jeremy Corbyn had been in 2017, and so it's easy and was less well liked also than Theresa May. And so some of the obviously, because of the nature of politics, Boris Johnson is seen as a far more successful leader than Theresa May, but it was partly because he was facing such a diminished opponent. I'll rush through the final few slides briefly, but I think some of the focus groups that were conducted by people like Lord Ashcroft, Tony Blair Institute, and others during the campaign and its aftermath, I think shed a great deal of insight and qualitative insight, confirming some of the dilemmas faced by voters and the drivers of the vote. We have kind of a quote on the dilemma of choice. I like the Labour Party, but I don't like Jeremy Corbyn. That idea that Corbyn was a driver. A lot of scepticism about the manifesto being pie in the sky. This idea that Labour had come to stand for particular sorts of groups of people in society, young people and students, but not working people. And also the idea that this was a kind of lending of votes. There's no loyalty, people saying they didn't mean they'd vote Conservative in the future, but this was one vote. And that came through a great deal in the focus groups. I didn't like there was in one of the Lord Ashcroft groups, there was a rather fun exercise asking people, what would Jeremy Corbyn do if he found himself unexpectedly free on a Friday night? And I think in some ways the quotes distill down Corbyn's problem and how his conduct over the previous 2 years had severely damaged him with the electorate. James Johnson Ransom has also written a little bit about how things like the Salisbury attacks and so forth started coming up as being kind of critical points at which he lost the electorate. But so when they were asked this, the focus group's participants said he'd go outside in the garden and sit in the fence all night. That kind of straddling the fence on Brexit really was starting to kind of hit through. A nice sit-down dinner with someone who doesn't like Britain. Whereas Boris Johnson, again, the quotes are not ones of great respect. He's going to get up to something, a bit of a messy night out. So, his reputation preceded him. I think there'll be apologies the next morning. But actually, he was up against someone whose reputation and profile had been severely damaged by preceding years. Just to close up, because I'm very conscious I've probably gone over time. Just in terms of long-term trends, I think it's really important to put some of the shifts in the electorate in context. We can see here that the age gap in the electorate in 2019 was wider than it's ever been between under 45s and over 45. Labour had the Conservatives had a lead of nearly 30 points among over 45s compared to and net deficit of 20 points under 45s. If we look at the educational polarization, that very clearly has been accelerate. Well, in some ways, arguably, kind of massively accelerated by Brexit. You can see in 2015 there was virtually no educational polarization, although over the longer term, Labour does seem to have, not even looking at 1979 as a starting point, does seem to have started doing better among graduates. But 2019 really opened that gap even wider than it had in 2017. And in terms of class politics, what we see really here was the using kind of the kind of classic classification of social grades. We see the Conservatives virtually no difference between ABC1s and C2DEs, and the same for Labour. Labour had actually made a bit of ground back with C2Ds and C2Ds in 2017, but in 2019, class politics had almost kind of leveled out, in the sense that we're not at the stage of a complete realignment, but certainly Labour's traditional advantage among working classes was all but gone. And finally, just in terms of kind of the value, the shift in the electorate around beyond those demographics, we can see that Brexit, in terms of the shift that has been fueled and accelerated by Brexit, this kind of huge opening up of the gap around Eurosceptic attitudes over the long term. So going from 1979, we see the Conservatives' share among Europhiles, people who are positive towards membership of the European Union and its predecessor organisations, declining just steadily from above 60% to below 20%, and conversely, the Labour's share among Eurosceptics collapsing from around 50% to 10% and rising among Europhiles. So there has been, so what we show in the book is really this combination between these short-term factors driven by leaders and the parties, but also this continuation of those long-term trends. Final thing I will just say briefly, I think one thing that I think is so crucial to think about in terms of the way we understand British politics today is actually about the shifting values of the electorate as a whole, but also of the voters of the parties. This is analysis by Paula, and actually, when you put the average position of voters on slight adaptations of the traditional left, right, and liberal authoritarian scales, we can see actually that for all the talk of the electorate moving to the right, the populist shift, the British electorate was more left on economic issues and more left on liberal issues than it has ever been. However, if we look at the positions of the electorates of the voters of the two parties, it becomes very evident what Labour's problem is, and that is simply that its voters are very, very far away from the median voter in both their liberal and their economic values, whereas the Conservative, you can see that in the bottom left-hand quadrant, whereas the Conservatives' voters in 2019 were a little bit to the left of their 2017 electorate and a little bit further beyond the economic position of the 2015 electorate, and they were a little bit more right on social conservative attitudes, but in both instances were much closer to the median voter. And so the long-term challenge for Labour is obviously kind of exemplified by this, that although the electorate may be moving to the left on liberal, in general, on social liberal issues and on left-right economic issues, that its electorate is a very, very long way away from that. And without further ado, I've probably gone on far too long. I will hand over to Steve, who's going to talk about the electoral geography of the vote. So I have to stop sharing.
Hi, everyone. I should probably ask whoever's chairing this whether we can go over time, because I think we've only got 10 minutes left. And
Hi there, Steve.
what to do about that? Yeah,
we can have an extra 5 minutes, but after that the system will kick us out. So
all right.
So you have 15 minutes.
I do have 15 minutes, but then there'll be no Q&A. So I will try to really whip through this. Thank you, and I really enjoyed the other presentations. And they framed this nicely because they showed just how important Brexit was to this election. And this chapter that I did with John Curtis and Patrick English kind of takes the Brexit issue, asks how it played out in different constituencies, and then how that affected the outcome of the general election. And if Brexit is a heavy part of the vote and how people made a decision in this general election, then what's really happening is you're going to be asking people to revisit what they did in 2016, because they hadn't really changed their minds much. The Leavers still wanted to leave, and the Remainers still wouldn't have changed their mind if the referendum had come about again. And so we're inevitably going to see more correlation with voting in the 2016 referendum. Now that, as you'll remember, was 52% vote for Leave. And because of the geography of the Leave vote, fully 63% of constituencies, according to the Chris Hanretti estimates, voted for Brexit. And that geography will turn out to be very important for the outcome, because by 2019, 52% of the vote was for parties that supported a second referendum, who were supported largely by people who supported Remain. But still, we ended up with 56% of seats for the Conservatives, who were there to get Brexit done. So we wanted to sort of unpick what's going on there and how much it mattered that voting was conditioned on Brexit opinion, how much it was about the geography and the distribution of support for Brexit and getting Brexit done, how much it was due to the division of the vote between the second referendum parties and also on the Brexit side. And we look into pacts and tactical voting as part of that. And we also look at candidate characteristics and activities, but I don't have time to talk about those. So this graph tells you a lot about the constituency variation in party performance. So this is a change in the share of the vote between 2017 and 19 for the Liberal Democrats, Conservatives and Labour, and that's turnout in grey. And you can see that as the percentage Leave vote in a constituency went up, the Conservatives did much better and Labour did much worse. But you can't really understand what's going on there unless you also split this out according to whether you're talking about seats that were won by the Conservatives and being defended by the Conservatives, or seats that are being defended by Labour. And you can see here in the Conservative Remain seats, the seats the Conservatives were defended but where Remain won in 2016, it was the Liberal Democrats who did really well, and Tories were actually losing votes. But as you move across to the Conservative Leave seats, very strong relationship with the Conservative performance, all the action going on here between Conservative and Liberal Democrat. And these are the best Conservative performances. The best Labour performances were in the Labour Remain seats here, but still Labour was losing votes and Conservatives. And now we have the Brexit Party. We're gaining votes. Brexit Party obviously starting from zero. And then the relationship strengthens dramatically as you get into the Labour Leave votes, with the very worst performances for Labour in these Labour Leave seats. And they're apparently losing votes to the Conservatives and to the Brexit Party quite heavily. Now, it might look like, because they faced competition here from two Brexit parties, that what's going on here is that they're more likely to experience decline as a result of having more choice. And of course, part of the argument for Nigel Farage having a Brexit party standing in Labour Leave seats was he thought that that his party could attract voters that the Conservatives would not be able to attract. But that doesn't actually seem to be the case from what we can see. Partly using British Election Internet Panel study, you can see that Labour Leave voters were actually more loyal to Labour where there was a Brexit Party candidate than elsewhere. So we spent a lot of time, and we're really interested and love to talk to you more about the puzzle of trying to figure out how much of an effect the Brexit Party had. But partly in interest of time, to cut it very fine, if you analyse how these 2017 Labour Leave voters switched when there was and there wasn't a Brexit Party candidate, and controlling for various things, and also bring in issues of how much they like the party leaders and the parties, and then you model all of that stuff, we came to the conclusion that Brexit Party voters, if they hadn't been able to vote for the Brexit Party, would have split something like 70% Conservative and 30% Labour if there had been no Brexit candidate. And the implication of that is that the Brexit Party effectively cost the Tories 25 hypothetical gains from Labour, and it cost the Tories a majority of 130 because that they might have otherwise have got. The other side of the coin is, well, what was the effect of the Brexit Party not standing in Conservative seats? Well, that's much more limited because the Conservatives were doing well in the Conservative Leave seats, where the Brexit Party might have hoped to get seats. And so it would have been very hard for the Brexit Party to take enough votes to really deny Conservative parties Conservative Leave seats there, or even many Conservative Remain seats. And so we estimate, on the basis of our modelling, it would have been just about 5 seats that the Tories would have lost had the Brexit Party stood in Tory seats. Looking in more detail about what the Tories did win, they won. There was only 75 seats that changed hands at this election in Britain. 52 of them were Conservative gains in Labour Leave seats. And they were mostly in these red wall seats that became famous in the Midlands, North Wales, and Northern England. And it was mostly that because there were only 16 Southern Labour Leave seats to be had. Only 2 of them switched. But whether or not a Labour Leave seat was lost to the Tories was not so much, we found, about whether it was a Northern seat or a Southern seat. It was basically that Labour were losing Labour Leave seats. And as a point I didn't mention on the slide, it was earlier, it was mostly compositional, that the Labour vote in the Labour Leave seats was more of a Leave vote than the Labour vote in the Labour Remain seats. It wasn't so much a contextual effect. So we've now got a Conservative government trying to defend lots of Northern Conservative marginals with levelling up. That might be the right strategy for defending them, but we should remember that they came about primarily because of Brexit geography, not so much because of class geography, but there is some class geography still there, and even though, as Will showed you, at the individual level, there wasn't much class voting. So bringing you right back to the very initial question about distribution of votes and seats, we think that one of the reasons why the electoral system was so good for the Conservatives was basically because it already was before, and even a uniform change would have given the Conservatives quite a big majority. Actually, the distribution of the vote being, the party performance being heavily structured by Leave Remain further advantaged the Conservatives. And so that was part of the story. But on a more fundamental level, this was a classic story of divide and conquer, with first past the post really punishing causes where votes are split between multiple parties. And it wasn't absolutely entirely that, because we do need to remember that some 20% of Remainers ended up voting for the Conservatives, which is an important bedrock for the Conservative vote. And then geography of the Leave vote was very important, but we should also remember that even though the pro-Brexit parties, the Conservatives and the Brexit Party, won 47% of the vote overall, they would still, because of the geographical advantage, have got just over half the seats. If you compare adding the Conservatives and Brexit vote compared with adding all the pro-referendum party votes together. Our chapter and the appendix covers loads more issues about the results and the outcome, including Scotland turnout and other issues. And I hope you'll get a chance to read it at some stage. Thank you all very much. And as I try to stop sharing, let me thank the other authors of the book and the conference organisers.